Welcome, everybody, to Freelance Writing Direct. I'm your host, Estelle Erasmus, the author of Writing That Gets Noticed, Find Your Voice, Become a Better Storyteller, Get Published, and it is now a course at NYU and an elective towards the journalism certificate. Every week, I speak with novelists, with authors, with writers of every niche to talk about their tips, their tricks, their strategies, and how the sauce is made, including creative advice. I'll talk about essays and articles and share my own experience from 3 decades of publishing. So join me every week and grow your business and build your craft with Freelance Writing Direct. And don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review on iTunes, and follow along on Substack, where I share special clips for subscribers only at estelleserasmus.substack.com. Welcome, everybody, to this episode of Freelance Writing Direct. I'm your host, Estelle Erasmus, and I'm so happy to have Betsy Lerner with us today. And we're going to be talking about her new book, Shred Sisters. Let me tell you a little bit about Betsy. She's the author of the recently released novel, Shred Sisters. And she's also the author of The Bridge Ladies, The Forest for the Trees, and Food and Loathing. With Temple Grandin, she is the co-author of the New York Times bestseller, Visual Thinking, The Hidden Gifts of People Who Think in Pictures, Patterns, and Abstractions. She received an MFA from Columbia University in poetry, where she was selected as one of Penn's emerging writers. She also received the Tony Godwin Publishing Prize for editors. After working as an editor for 15 years, she became an agent and is currently a partner with Dunow, Carlson, and Lerner literary agency. Congratulations on your book, Betsy. It's such a fascinating read, and it's really getting accolades. It's long listed for the Center for Fiction First Novel Prize. It's a New York Times Book Review Editor's Choice and Best Book of the Year so far. It's a Good Housekeeping October Book Club pick, and a Most Anticipated Book from Literary Hub and Kirkus Reviews, and a Best Book of Fall from Bustle. So many accolades and so well-deserved. I've been reading a lot of novels. I've had a lot of novelists on the program, and what I loved about Shred Sisters, it's such a wild, fast, fun ride with so much depth to it. So Betsy, this is your first novel. This is your debut novel. How did you decide to write a novel? And what made you decide on the topic of these 2 very different sisters? Ollie, who has mental health issues, which were undiagnosed at the time, because this book is set in the earlier time of the 70s, 60s, decades ago. And Amy, who it's also like a coming of age story for Amy at the same time as you cover the fracturing of family and just so much. So where did that come from, the idea? And maybe tell a little bit about the story also in your words.
Sure. The book, I didn't plan to write it. I didn't set out to write a novel. I've always been a nonfiction writer. And I had just finished Visual Thinking, which you mentioned, with Temple Grandin, which had 1 million footnotes and research and academic papers. So I think that coming off of that, there must have been something lurking that would be very liberating to write fiction, perhaps. But the deeper story and the much sadder story is that 5 years ago, our family experienced a horrible tragedy. My niece and nephew were killed by a drunk driver. And then, and in that same 4 or 5 month period, my mom died and my best friend committed suicide. So I was really encased in grief. At the same time, COVID hit, and my sister, whose kids were killed, lived in LA, and I could no longer stay with her and visit with her. My older sister and I had been taking turns to help her and her husband. So we felt very anxious about her care. And we felt that, as my older sister put it, we needed to have eyes on her. So the three of us started to work out every morning over FaceTime and plugging into the same YouTube instructor. We would do these crazy workouts in our basements, but it served as a way of keeping eyes on her and helping her and being together. We called it shredding. And then we started calling ourselves the Shred Sisters. So that was also at work. There was this grief. There was this bond that was rekindled. My sisters and I have always had very fractious, competitive, difficult relationships, close to one at one time, then another at another time. You know, the way things move in families, it's not usually finite. They're fluid, these relationships. Anyway, I was the middle. I had all the problems. And I think all that was working through me the day that I just sat down and started the book. And then it just came out really in a gush. I wrote it really, really fast. And then it did take me a long time to revise it and get it into some shape. But that's the genesis.
This is so interesting. I mean, born out of, the horrible situations that you were dealing with and the grief, this very compelling story of a family, family in the middle of being fractured and mental health issues and sisters and all the resonant topics that everyone, even if they don't have a sister with mental health issues, can relate to the feelings of estrangement, whether they have family members, sisters, or something in their lives. It's a very universal situation that people can relate to. In your book, you really move forward with a story of a coming of age of Amy, because it's also her finding herself throughout the book and forgiving herself, as you say at the end, and finding her value with relationships or not finding her value. And also Ollie. And there's sort of, I don't want to give it away, but there's a redemption arc built in for Ollie.
Well, a lot of people think the book is very autobiographical, and they think that I'm Amy, and it's because it's a first-person narrator, and Amy is the narrator. And I think whenever we read a first-person narrative, or actually when we read just about anything, we look to see what's autobiographical, right? Because even though it's fiction, we want to feel that it's real. And if you think it is real, then you want to know what is actually real about it. That's what my experience is anyway. The fact is I'm Amy and I'm Ollie, and I was misdiagnosed for over 15 years and eventually got on the right medication. And then, like a lot of people with mental illness, went off of it, went on. And then when I had my child, I committed to staying on the medication, and I've been stable for 35 years without a single episode of depression or mania. So that's another story that was working through me. I mean, everything in this novel, in reflection, I see is an aspect of my life or a set of circumstances, all that grief. You earlier said that everybody can relate. And one of the things I'm hearing from a lot of parents who are dealing with kids, and they say they relate. And I attribute that to the fact that though this is a coming of age, I didn't write it when I was coming of age. I didn't write it in my 20s. I wrote it in my 60s as a parent. So I have the perspective of the 15-year-old and the 60-year-old, and I think that all of that also went into the book. And it's a bit of a hat trick, right? Because it is a young narrator, but she actually has a shitload of experience.
Yes, yes. I'm so glad you answered how, like, where you came up with the title, because I was wondering about that. It's alliteration. I love alliteration in a title, but it actually has that basis in what you were doing, shredding, and then they called you the Shred Sisters. That's so
By the way,
cool.
I never intended it to be the title. It was a placeholder. And then for some reason I gave Amy the name Amy Shred, which I also was just sort of fooling around, noodling around the way you do with character names. It's like naming a baby, it's like you think you want this name, but then it doesn't seem like the baby. It's a crazy thing naming characters, but it's like it started to stick. And then I started having people tease her, rhyming off of her name, Shredhead, and things like that. And then it just sort of took on a life of its own.
I love that. I wanted to ask you, you're an agent, and so you do a lot of reading. Is the reading, did that help you with writing? Like knowing good writing, knowing what you recognize as an agent? How did that work in your process?
Well, I was an editor for 15 years before I was an agent, and I continue to do a lot of editing on my clients' manuscripts. And all that editing taught me so much about, I think the biggest thing writers struggle with is structure. I mean, if you have a voice, you have a voice. If you have a story, you have a story. But structure is something people really struggle with, in my opinion, or certainly as an editor, the thing I think I impact the most. I mean, yes, on the line level, the copy editing, the repetitions, the tense syntax, all those things you're always looking out and fixing and helping the author with. But structure is a big one, especially for a book. Holding an entire book in your head often takes somebody else to look at it and say, oh, the beginning is actually here, and this needs to develop, or it stops short here, and how do you pick up the pace again, or transitions are a huge key and tool to making people turn the page.
Absolutely. Can you talk a little bit more about transitions? I'm a big advocate of transitions as well.
Well, I really learned about transitions getting my MFA in poetry, because when I was a young writer writing poetry, I really had no idea what I was doing. I was just writing lines and they were shorter than full sentences, and it wasn't until I went to graduate school, I guess somewhat in college too, really studying poetry, that I realized every line break was a transition. There's so much drama in a line break. You have to know how to break your lines. And so I kind of extrapolated from that and thought about chapters and parts within chapters, that every time you have a new paragraph or a space break between paragraphs or a new chapter, those are opportunities to jump with the reader. So many mistakes I see that young writers make is that they think they need to tell you how they got to the store, on the bus, in a car, on a train. They don't see that, oh no, the reader is with you. If the voice is authoritative and consistent, you can make those jumps, those transitions. And
Yes.
sometimes you want to slow a transition down, or sometimes you want to use a reflection or a fast forward, as I like to call it, foreshadowing. You have all of these tools to slow down, speed up, change scenes. It's thrilling, all the tools that you have at your disposal to move a narrative.
I love that. It's like what a screenwriter does, right? They paint a picture with, the words that are then used in the movie. It's kind of like panning in. With breaks, like I could see ending a chapter and then making the reader want to turn the page and read more. And so it's really craft, like the structure, like you said, it could be the word level. I mean, people can put a sentence together, but it's the connection of the different sentences and then what it leads to, which is where the true craft comes in. And I just wanted to read a small part from your book, if that's okay, so that people can really see your style of writing. And you break the book up into three parts. Part one, don't feed the fish. Part two, never give up on your hair. And part three, inchworm. And oh, I also wanted to mention before I read, you start almost with an inciting incident where Amy is getting hurt because of Ollie. And then this is a through line throughout the book, the hurts that are happening. And I thought it was very clever how you started in a way to get our interest. Was that part of the focus?
It wasn't the first scene that I wrote. It originally ended the first chapter, but then I saw that the first paragraph or two was really expository, and I realized I wanted something to get people in. And I also rewrote that scene so that it encapsulated almost everything that would go on in the entire book, because I also have I don't know which teacher said it years ago, but like this acorn theory that like everything in the book should fit in the first paragraph into like an acorn, and then the book is the blooming of the whole thing. And so you want the seeds in that first paragraph or chapter. Everything that happens needs to pay off. And sometimes you don't realize it until you finish the book, but then you can go back and plant those seeds, because that's also part of the narrative thrust, right? Is
Yes.
how are you going to be satisfied by where the author brings you? You know, it has to connect with where they take you.
Yes, and there's a forward momentum to your writing, which just takes the reader by the hand and brings them along into each of this aspect. And you do something also, which is you kind of give these little nicknames that Amy has for her sister, and that kind of pulls through also throughout. And that just builds in who they are as characters. It's kind of ways of showing it without telling. I still think, like Philip LePage says, there still needs to be a certain amount of telling because there's the reflection part, but the showing through relationship and games and things like that, I think is so helpful. I want to just read this part. It's on page 32. My parents split slowly like continental drift, the subterranean forces that caused the rift between the jagged coasts of South America and Africa. You could say Ollie was the force that drove them apart. My mother declared Ollie too much to handle, now skipping school on a semi-regular basis, the skunky smell of marijuana trailing her throughout the house. She would beg our father for help, but he would downplay her behavior, believing it was phase that Ollie would grow out of it like a pair of shoes. When Ollie turned 16 and passed her driving test, our mother said a car was out of the question. A yellow VW Bug showed up in our driveway. Dad didn't want to make a big deal of it. She needed it to get to school and practice, he said. It would make our mother's life easier. Ollie threw her arms around our dad, jumped into the driver's seat, and took her new car for a spin around the block. Why do I have to be the bad cop? My mother said, standing in the driveway. It's not about being the bad cop, Dad said. You're always the hero. Lorraine, someone has to reel that girl in. Ollie had a fender bender within the first months of getting the car. My mother wanted to take away her keys. That just shows through scene and some description, really vivid description, this fracturing of a family. It's definitely showing how the dad acted, and it sets the stage for later on. In terms of crafting that, did you think you had to use a certain amount of dialogue?
That's a really good question. I think a lot of it's intuitive. You know, you kind of hear the beats, you kind of know when you need a little bit of dialogue to, as you say, fill out the character. I think people overuse dialogue. I think people misuse dialogue. I've seen that quite a lot. People don't tend to speak in full sentences, at least not in conversation, but you need a little bit of it to ground the story a bit. And I just kept wanting to show and progress the parents, you know, not being on the same page, and the mother's rising worry slash hysteria slash not wanting to be blamed, and the father's sort of constant defending of Ollie, in denial of how bad it could be. But he's also, his role in the family as the peacekeeper. He also kind of thinks he can help everybody just by paying some money and, you know, supporting them that way. Whereas, you know, the mother she's dependent on him, so that's not something she can do. but often in family dynamics, people kind of harden into their roles, whether they want to or not.
Yeah, you don't shy away from like power dynamics and talking about them. And I think that's really important because a lot of the family dynamics is about power. You know, sometimes, especially back in those days when it was really patriarchal, you know, that was showing that is an element of showing why later Ollie finds her power in other places. And Amy maybe looks for it through work or in, you know, not as much.
Ollie has the power in the family from the time she's a little girl and refuses to leave the zoo. You know, the person often with mental illness takes all the air out of the room. They become everyone's focal point, whether, you know, often at huge cost and disruption. Uh, and even when they're not there, their effect is really powerful. So I think that Ollie has the power, is holding the power over that family.
Definitely. And there are also themes of betrayal in all the different relationships from, you know, the parents to Ollie to Amy to all the relationships. And I feel like you really handle it very realistically, like betrayal does happen. But sometimes in novels, it happens and you're like, well, where did this come from? But I think you take, again, you're taking the reader by the hand. So we can see maybe the little Easter eggs or seeds that you've dropped along the way. And I guess being someone who's I'm an editor as well, being somebody who's vigilant, and I think that translated from my personal into my work. It's like I can see those little seedlings. I'm like, oh, okay, something's going to happen. And so did you look at, because I'm fascinated with structure as well. Did you think when you were doing it, like, okay, this is going to be a seed or an Easter egg, kind of giving a hint at what's coming?
Yeah, I did not write it in a linear fashion. I love jumping ahead, and I thought that made the book more fun and more interesting. And my editor really impressed upon me to put it in order in a linear fashion. And I was a little nervous at first because I thought it would take some of the fun out of it. But the minute I tried it, I realized that she was right. And it was actually more suspenseful, not knowing what was going to happen instead of giving it away and then retracing and explaining why. Like she called it backfilling. I just had to keep taking stuff from the back and put it in an order. And I'm also somewhat obsessed with certain symmetries. Like I like chapters to be about the same length, and I like books in 3 parts. I like because I think maybe I love plays, and or just the idea of beginning, middle, and end. I think is very satisfying to tell the reader we're climbing up the mountain. We're on top of the mountain and now we're going down. You know, I like that feeling in a book. I don't want to climb 90% of the way and then be dropped off. And I
Yeah.
also don't like it when chapters are uneven. I think the same thing with stanzas in poetry. You kind of, there's a natural internal rhythm for it could be 3-page chapters, it could be 30-page chapters, and it could be patterns of long, short, or even long, long, short. But I think that there's internal patterns in the way you lay out a book that actually have logic. And so those are all things one does in revision, obviously, but I'm very obsessed with all of that.
Yeah, and you also use alliteration. I love alliteration, and I see this skunky smell of marijuana, you know, skipping school on a semi-regular basis, downplay her behavior, believing it would like I just think it rolls off the tongue. Do you read out your own writing to yourself after you write it?
Yeah, I read everything out loud. Yeah. I think part of why I do it also is just to slow down because I'm a very fast writer. And in fact, one of my previous books, a good friend of mine read it and said, "Did you print this out and read it out loud?" And I was really abashed because I hadn't. And he said, "I think that will help a great deal." And it did. And now it's part of the process. Yeah, for
It's
sure.
hard.
But for me, it's just because of the speed that I write with and think with. My brain is really on fire a lot of the time when I'm writing, and I need to slow down. In fact, I hate revising because it's such a slow process.
It is. What other parts of your process can you share that could be helpful?
Well, the thing that everybody hates to know about me is that I get up at 4:30, 5 o'clock,
Oh my
and I
God.
do all my writing until about 9:30. And then I turn on my agent hat and I work all day as an agent. So that's a lot of discipline. I'm also a natural early riser. I love that time that my daughter's out of the house now, and my dog is dead. But for most of my writing life, I come 8:30, little people needed me, little dog needed me, husband, making noise. So I had to do it then just for the quiet and concentration. And also the minute I let clients' problems and publishers' issues and all that into my head, I can't I can't really write at that point. So I created that very quiet time of a few hours every day for myself. And that's that's my
But
process.
no, that's great that you honor that time for yourself because it's important. Like some people, they sign up for groups and they do writing with each other. I find I'm a solitary writer also. Like I can't write in a big group, but I appreciate when people can. So I want to do a little segue here. You have also become somewhat of a TikTok sensation, Betsy. You have 21,200 followers on TikTok. How did that happen? When did you think, okay, I'm going to start doing this?
Well, as an agent, I was starting to hear a lot of publishers say that the only thing that moves the needle is TikTok. So, and of course, Colleen Hoover and that incredible story.
Yeah.
So I just am a student of publishing and I wanted to see what they're talking about. So it took me a while to figure it out, to figure out book talk and start getting to see what the influencers did and how books got recommended and how books became memes. And, the more you saw it, the more you saw it. And I just really got into it. And then I started to dabble with creating some content, which was not that much of a leap for me because I've blogged for years and I'm used to putting little bits of writing and pictures up. So it was just a matter of adding it, changing it to video. And so I started experimenting with little silly literary videos that nobody was following. And then someone who's really good at TikTok told me that I had to get on camera if I wanted to have any kind of following and that I needed to find a lane. And she said, you should give publishing advice, right? That's like what you do. You could do that with your eyes closed. I didn't want to do it because there were already influencers doing really fantastic advice on book talk. And I've been doing it for 35 years. Like I didn't want to keep doing that. So I had this brainstorm because she said to me, you have to do something you can do every day. Like it's your own TV channel. So that rang a bell for me. And I went home and I was thinking what I might do. And I realized I had a stack of diaries from my 20s. And I thought, "Oh, I wonder if I read a little bit from my diary or tell people I'm going to look at my diaries and try to figure out who I was, if that would resonate." So I made one post and that went viral. So that's how I went from 200 followers to 2,000. And then more and more people started to watch them. I post every day, which you really need to do. And a lot of people find that really daunting. It's not daunting to me. So yeah, I started doing it and then they don't all go viral, but enough went viral to get me to 20,000. I'd like to get bigger, but you cannot game the algorithm. The algorithm takes and gives when it wants.
So is the diary entries like forever? Like, do you have so many more that you can go back to?
You want me to show you?
Yeah. Wow, look at that. That's amazing. Betsy, that's amazing. Look at
Yeah,
that, everyone.
there's a few more.
Oh my gosh, amazing. That's okay. You have answered my question. So, what other kind of advice would you give to somebody who's maybe writing their first novel?
Well, don't expect it to get published. Understand that you might have to write 2 or 3 or 4, and that a project that you start, you might not finish. And then you might feel like a failure or that it's not right for you, but you might start again a year later. It's a long game. It's a really long game. And you should, in my opinion, never make yourself write. You just have to write. And if you're not writing, that's okay too. But if you're a writer, you should be writing every day. I mean, whether it's a diary, a blog, a letter, a poem, it's also a muscle. If you wanted to be a concert pianist, you'd practice every day. So if you want to be a published novelist, you should probably practice every day. Even if
Yes.
even if what you're writing, doesn't get published. So many published authors have 2 or 3 books that never saw the light of day. We all think, oh, the corrections, he came out of the womb with corrections. Well, there was a novel before that that didn't do very well. And my guess is there's probably a lot of other pages that never saw the light of day.
Oh, no, you're so right. It's really a muscle, to keep writing. And now you have your TikTok muscle also, which I guess you're doing that in the morning when you wake up. Is that part of the writing time or
When
a
I'm
different?
finished with my pages, I often do a little TikTok. And I'm in my bathrobe when I do them. I don't do anything. A lot of people, put on makeup and get really gorgeous. For me, I started doing it then, and I was in my pajamas. I didn't even really think about it, but it's kind of you develop a style and in blogging and TikTok and writing and in anything, and then you see what works, and if it works, you lean that way. It's a process. Writing is communicating. Making TikTok videos it's all communication. And some of it lands on deaf ears, and some of it sparks a little attention, some of it goes viral. But you just have to keep putting it out there and not really caring what happens or what people think. I do all this a lot for my own amusement.
And you did mention that you had a lot of fun with this book, which I suspect, I mean, because writing a nonfiction book is a little less fun because there's the research that I know. And so I get that. And I think that comes through. It really comes through in the book. Betsy, what's next for you as a writer? And we're going to have a whole separate conversation about you as an agent because I'm inviting you back on the program to talk about agenting.
Oh, thank you. So, I mean, I also never told anyone I was writing Shred Sisters except my husband. I didn't tell a soul because I didn't know if it would materialize, and I didn't want anyone asking me, and I just didn't want to talk about it. So I don't talk about whatever I'm doing. I'm just doing it. Though I will say I would love somebody to option the rights, and I would love to write the screenplay. I've written a bunch of screenplays over the years, had a couple close calls, but nothing ever came of it. So that's still a long time dream of mine.
I love that. Let's put that out into the universe and have it manifest.
The rights are available.
Who would you see as the lead for Amy for Ollie? I feel like Nicole Kidman would want to wrap herself around Ollie for some reason. I could just see her doing it.
She's too old, but
I know.
she could be the mom. She'd make a great mom.
She'd be
Yeah.
great. She
For
would.
Ollie, I sort of see somebody like Florence Pugh. I love her. And for Amy, I see somebody much more demure. There's a young actress I love named Thomasin McKenzie. A lot of people don't know her, but she was in Jojo Rabbit and she was in Eileen, the Tessa Moshfegh novel. I think she's remarkable. And not that I think about these things very much.
Hey, look, again, putting it out there, I think is important.
We have 2 posts on my videos of my TikToks where I put up the faces of 4 actresses and I ask people to vote who they would like.
I love that. Well, I'm going to include your TikTok so you can have thousands more followers on TikTok because I think it's fascinating. I literally only post once a week, but now I need to rethink that.
Posting on TikTok?
Yeah, I post clips
Wow, you.
from my podcast. So yeah,
Oh,
but I should just speak. I used to do a little speaking, just speaking to the camera, but I kind of stopped that with sharing clips from the podcast. But I think it's a good idea. I love what you're doing. So this has been so wonderful. Any last word of advice for anybody who is trying to write their story, whether it gets published or not, in a craft? What's a craft tip that you can just throw out?
what I said before, writing every day. That's really it. Reading and writing and immersing yourself in a literary community if you can find one, getting feedback from other writers, not your sister or your mother, you know.
Yeah.
Thinking of yourself more professionally when you're ready to go from being what I call a closet writer to someone who's ready to connect, and figuring out when is the right time too. People just think because they wrote a novel that they're ready, and they need to workshop their material. They need to get feedback. It's all part of the process. So I
Yes.
would say that's all really important, but it takes time, patience.
Yeah. And a lot of people, they might not have patience in today's noisy, digital, fast-paced environment. But even if you think fast, like you do, you still have to respect the process. Yeah.
Building an audience is also part of the work. And I think there are a lot of ways now that we didn't have before,
Yes.
where, what I mean, and for me, it was a blog, but now that's, people are using Substack now. And I think other platforms to develop your voice and connect and find an audience. So that's
Is,
really important.
is Substack something that you're doing now, or is that?
No, I'm not doing Substack, but a lot of writers are, and I know agents at my office are finding new clients on Substack. You
Yeah.
know, once you show that you can have an audience and you can sustain an idea and a voice, you're halfway there.
Yeah.
Can you imagine an agent calling you and saying, "Oh, I read your work on Substack, or I saw your article, and I'd love to take you to lunch and talk about whether or not this could be a book"? I mean, that's what I do as an agent. So, how am I going to find people? Well, they have to be generating some material for me to see and feel inspired by.
Yes, it's like you must continue to write, you must continue to develop content that comes out authentically of what you're doing, what you're interested in, and what you're writing. So I love that. I'm on Substack, Estelle Erasmus Writing That Gets Noticed. Thank you so much, Betsy, for being on the program, for
Thank you. This is
sharing
lovely.
your fabulous book and wonderful advice.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Follow me at EstelleSErasmus.com on my website and on social media, which is Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter at Estelle S. Erasmus. And we're now on YouTube for Freelance Writing Direct. Follow along, and soon everyone will be reading what you're writing.